During the last few months of production on Resident Evil Village, the Capcom Division 1 manager Jun Takeuchi assigned some of the game's producers to move away from assisting with the polish stage of the main game, and instead get a head start on the game's DLC. Resident Evil 7's DLC had been massively successful both critically and commercially, so the team already knew that they wanted to have a similar level of post-launch content for Village. One of the producers assigned to this, Masachika Kawata, proposed that instead of making a large number of smaller DLCs, they instead make only a couple of much larger and richer offerings compared to what was seen in RE7. He immediately suggested that the team could make a Mercenaries mode for the game, as that iconic side mode hadn't been seen since the release of Resident Evil 6 back in 2012, and he also proposed a full story expansion where players would take the role of Rosemary Winters after she's all grown up. The team loved this idea and got to work on making both of these right away. And thankfully, those two wouldn't be the only DLC offerings we would end up seeing for the game, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Today, we're going to take a look back on all of the DLC content released for Resident Evil Village, and discuss whether or not they're worth checking out if you haven't already, as DLC content of even the mainline Resident Evil titles is often overlooked in retrospectives like these, and even just in community discussion as a whole. So, was the Resident Evil Village DLC any good? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 30th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but I would of course recommend that you've seen my video on the base game of Resident Evil Village, as I won't really be going over the design of it or my personal thoughts on it here in this video. So for those of you who are interested in checking out those, or just the rest of the retrospective first, I'll have the full series playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, we're going to be approaching these DLCs just like I did in my videos on the Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 7 DLCs, which, if you're not familiar, means that we're going to go one DLC at a time in the order they were released and assess them all on their own individual merit before assessing the overall package. Which is a little more awkward with Village, because we only actually have one individual DLC release, and then the rest of them all released together as one larger bundle, but we're just gonna stick with that method anyway. It's also worth mentioning before getting into them that I actually have not played a single one of these DLC before making this video. So despite me being a lifelong Resident Evil fanboy, you're getting a first-timer's perspective on all of these today. We all on the same page now? Great, let's get into it then. The first of these is a bit of a weird one, because we're going to start out by talking about the return of the Mercenaries mode. As I'm sure a lot of you will already know, this was actually included with the game on release, but as mentioned earlier, this mode was developed entirely during the last few months of the game's production by the small team who was split off to work on the DLC. And it was only even announced in a live stream about 2 weeks before the game's release, as the team wasn't actually sure if it would be ready in time for launch or not. So since it was part of the larger DLC effort of the team, we're going to start by talking about this as a piece of free DLC content for the game. Also, maybe because it's going to come up later in the video, so I need to cover the basics of the mode itself first, but that's beside the point. Now, at a very fundamental level, this is a lot like the Mercenaries modes that we've seen in the past. You select a character, select a map, and fight against large numbers of enemies in an attempt to score as many points as possible before the time limit runs out. In this sense, it's very familiar for longtime fans, but Village probably makes the most changes to the mode that we've seen since they totally changed the mode and just kept the name when going from RE3 to RE4. Starting out with the basics though, Village's Mercenaries launched with only 4 maps, and 1 character. Yeah, Ethan was actually the only playable character when the mode first launched. So at a base level, the variety already isn't great, but let's talk about how things actually play here. Like I just mentioned, the format of the mode has changed quite a bit compared to the Mercenaries modes that we saw in RE4 through 6. Instead of loading in and being put right in the fight, you actually start out in a safe room with the Duke and a small amount of money to spend, allowing you to buy some supplies, weapons, and upgrades before starting the game proper. This is actually fairly fun because you basically get to make your own loadout on a limited budget at the start of every game, rather than just using a predetermined loadout. Which I would complain about this limiting the variety of the mode if we actually had a bunch of different characters, but seeing as Ethan is the only character we have, I actually think this was a pretty solid way to add some variety from game to game. Once you leave that room though, you'll be taken to the first area of the map, where you'll be tasked with running through and killing a minimum number of enemies before the timer runs out in order to open up the exit. You can of course kill more enemies than the required amount to open the exit if you want more points, and the game does actually have a large bonus that you'll be granted if you clear out every single one, but you'll obviously have to do so pretty quickly in order to not run out of time and end your run right there. Also within this area, you'll be able to find things like time bonuses and such, just like you'd be used to from prior Mercenaries modes. And they've also added these new roguelike styled upgrades that you can find that provide small permanent buffs to Ethan. These can be things like increasing your maximum health, your movement speed, your damage with a certain weapon class, really anything like that. And I absolutely love these upgrades. But it should also be noted here that I'm just a really big fan of roguelikes in general, so it's really only natural that I enjoy the variety and the random chance that these introduce into every run. After killing enough enemies and leaving the area though, you'll be taken back to that safe room where you can then use the money you earned while running through said area to acquire even more upgrades before heading to the next area of the map. Each map has anywhere from 2 to 5 areas, and these areas are always going to be the exact same instead of being randomized, so you do still learn the maps and the layouts just like you used to. And this, again, seems like a way to lean a bit more into that roguelike design and add a bit of progression to each run, which on paper I really like. But as we'll come back to in a bit, I'm not 100% on board with the way this idea was executed here. This loop will be repeated until you've cleared out all areas of the map, and if you manage to do so without running out of time, the game will end and you'll be given a rank ranging from C all the way up to triple S. Depending on what rank you get, you can also unlock rewards, with these following a pretty consistent formula. Getting a B rank will grant you some extra starting cash on future runs of that same map, getting an A rank will grant you access to the next map, and an S rank will actually grant you access to an entirely new ability that then gets added into that roguelike upgrade pool for future runs. There are further rewards for achieving a double S and a triple S rank on all maps in the game, and those are really special. But I'll try to keep at least a little surprise for those who haven't played the mode themselves yet, and not just spoil everything in this video. Overall, I think that this new formula for the Mercenaries is really fun, and I'm totally down for pretty much all of what I just described. But I think that there are a couple of key things that really hold it back for me. The first of these is something that I mentioned in my review of RE Village proper, that being that the combat gameplay of Village just isn't anywhere near as interesting as in prior action horror Resi games. Obviously, a huge part of what made the Mercenaries so much fun to begin with was that the combat of RE4, 5, and 6 was really good. But Village's combat is much more grounded and limited due to them wanting to maintain some more of that survival horror DNA instead of just going full action like they did before. That's not to say that the combat is necessarily bad in Village, because it's perfectly fine, but it's just not a combat system that has me wanting to go and boot the game up just to fight some enemies because the core mechanics are so much fun, which was kind of the appeal of the Mercenaries in RE4, 5, and 6 to begin with. Although, I will admit, I randomly happened to learn while playing Mercenaries for this video that you can cancel things like reloading and healing animations in this game simply by aiming your weapon, and using those animation cancels to speed things up and get kills faster to keep combos high was fairly satisfying. I also think that the more linear stage structure hurts the potential of this mode quite a bit, because, at least to me, it felt like I was always just racing to the next enemy's spawn point and trying to memorize the placement of every single spawn, rather than holding out against an unrelenting horde of enemies in a small space. I really do like what they're going for with the upgrade structure and the progression, but I think it could have been more fun if they had done something with like waves of enemies or just a series of smaller maps, rather than running through linear levels and trying to memorize the spawn points. Something that does add some more longevity to the mode though, is that once you've gotten an A rank on all 4 stages, you'll unlock the first of the hard stages. These are the same 4 maps from before, but they now have more enemies on them, and said enemies are now significantly more aggressive and also deal enough damage to put you into the critical state in just one attack. As if that wasn't enough, it also restricts Ethan to only having his basic Lemmy pistol, and while it does offer more powerful options in the shop like the Magnum and the grenade launcher, both of these weapons only have a set number of shots available for the entire run. So not only have the majority of your stronger options been taken away on this mode, but the few higher power options that you still have are incredibly limited and incredibly expensive. Meaning that if you want to buy one, you'll essentially be spending all of the money that you would have used to upgrade your handgun on just those few very powerful shots. It genuinely makes it really hard to balance out, and even after playing a bunch of the hard mode stages for myself, I couldn't really nail down a consistent build or strategy that worked for me on them. I mean, I did manage to get a couple of triple S ranks on them, but those were a real struggle for me. Overall though, Village's Mercenaries definitely offers a good bit of fun, but it just lacks the sort of depth and replayability that made so many out there absolutely fall in love with the mode in prior games. If this were a post-launch DLC like it was initially planned to be, it would be a bit of a toss-up on whether it was worth buying it or not. But as an additional piece of free content included with the launch of the game, I would say that this was a solid addition. After that initial launch though, it would actually be a good while until we got any more content for Resident Evil Village. Unlike what we saw with Resident Evil 7, where there was a consistent drip feed of DLC over the first year or so of the game being out. We wouldn't get any additional DLC for Village until late October of the next year, nearly a year and a half after the launch of the game itself. But when we did, it was a pretty big offering of content. On October 28th, 2022, we would see the release of the Winters expansion, featuring a whole new perspective for the main story, a massive expansion for the Mercenaries, and even a full story expansion, all for the price of $20 USD. So let's start with the simplest part of this package, the third-person mode for the main story. This, as you might have imagined, allows you to play the entirety of Resident Evil Village in third person, which I know many fans were thrilled about, since there are plenty of people out there who just don't enjoy the first-person perspective or get motion sickness from it, which made Village a hard game for those sorts of fans to get into. I booted up a bit of New Game Plus on the save file that I used for my review of the main game to mess around with it, and I have to say, I'm a bit mixed on this one. I think it's great to have it as an option for fans who would prefer it, but I personally just don't feel like the third-person perspective here feels anywhere near as good as the first-person does. And curiously, I also think it feels significantly worse to play than the RE2 or 3 remakes did. Ethan's third-person animations feel very half-baked and cheap, with even things like firing or reloading your weapons just feeling very floaty and like they lack any real weight behind them. Which is fairly weird because some of the animations here have a lot of weight and heft to them, but the inconsistency in the quality of all these different animations just feels a bit jarring at times. The camera also still pulls into a first-person perspective for things like cutscenes, which also disappointed me a bit because I was thinking that it would be really cool to see a lot of these scenes from an over-the-shoulder perspective. Though I do understand that for a lot of these, they just really wouldn't work, or be all that interesting in third person. And most interestingly of all, I found it surprisingly hard to navigate some areas of the game due to the way that things are laid out and framed for the first-person perspective. It's really easy to forget how much the perspective of a game influences every piece of its design, but playing Resident Evil Village in third person makes it abundantly clear, as you can just feel how much a lot of these environments are designed for first person while playing like this. I mean, just look at this. You can't even see where I'm going at all. So overall, I found playing in third person to be a cool novelty for a little bit, but the whole time, I just found myself thinking about how much better this game plays in first person. Like I said, I know that there were a lot of fans out there who felt like this edition finally made the game more enjoyable for them, or even just playable for them for the first time, and I'm really glad that it was able to do that for so many of you out there. But I just really didn't enjoy the way the game felt in this perspective. It's not a matter of me not enjoying third person by any means, as it is actually my preferred perspective for Resident Evil games, and many of my favorite Resi titles, and even just video games in general, are third person, but the third person in Village just feels like a very half-baked addition that conflicts with a lot of the game's existing design. Like I said, I'm glad it's there for those who enjoy it, but I just personally don't enjoy the third person as much as the first person for Village specifically. Moving on to the next part of the expansion though, we have all the new content that they brought to the Mercenaries with the Mercenaries Additional Orders. To start, we have 3 new playable characters for the Mercenaries in the form of Chris Redfield, Carl Heisenberg, and Alcina Dimitrescu. Chris feels absolutely incredible to play as, with him having a preset loadout of his signature pistol and rifle, and of course, his fists. He can't buy new weapons from the shop to customize his loadout like Ethan can either, making him a bit more of a specialized character, whereas Ethan is a bit of a Swiss Army knife in the Mercenaries. Further emphasizing this is the fact that Chris can't guard or use healing items like Ethan can. But his guns are significantly stronger than anything available to Ethan, and he's actually retained his melee attacks and finishers from RE5 and 6, which makes Chris a character who's designed for more overwhelming offense, rather than one who's designed to play more defensively like Ethan. He also has a sort of ultimate ability called Onslaught, that's charged up by getting kills with melee attacks, or guns if you can get the upgrades that allow for it, that will briefly grant Chris higher damage, faster fire rate, and massively increased reload and movement speed. The duration of this ability also increases if you continue to get more kills while it's active, so again, his playstyle heavily encourages you to just always be moving forward and blasting through enemies as quickly as possible, which coincidentally is kind of the whole point of the mode in the first place. And when you clear a stage with Chris with an S rank or higher, you'll even unlock some new unique roguelike upgrades that are exclusive to him, like getting increased bullet damage after landing a melee attack, or passively refilling his onslaught gauge over time. This is true of all of the new characters as well, which gives an actual reason to replay all of the stages and shoot for higher ranks with every character, as it will significantly increase the effectiveness of those characters on future runs. Let it be known though, that I absolutely loved playing as Chris in the Mercenaries here in Village, and he's easily my favorite character of the entire roster. Moving on to Heisenberg, he really sells the feeling of playing as a boss character. His hammer is technically his only weapon, but that's really no issue because his basic swings deal a good amount of damage, and each attack that you land charges the hammer up with electricity that can be used for a large slam attack. This already makes him a much more powerful melee character than Chris is, but pushing that even further, he has his own version of Ethan's guard where he can shield himself with metal, and also has the ability to just yank enemies directly to him at any time. And of course, he's able to manipulate metal much like you'd expect, with him being able to send buzzsaws and other scraps of metal flying at enemies with the press of a button. And as if all of that wasn't enough, He even has an ability that allows him to summon a Soldat to send toward the enemies for a huge burst of damage. Though this one is on a timed cooldown to at least somewhat balance him out. So overall, he is a super fun character to play, but I personally found him more gimmicky and less replayable in the long term than either Ethan or Chris. And last, but certainly not least, Lady Dimitrescu comes in and somehow one-ups Heisenberg in the boss character department. Her basic attacks are very simple, with her just being able to use her claws for melee strikes. Every attack you land on enemies will then add to her thrill gauge, with this gauge making her progressively faster and deadlier as it fills up, even unlocking new abilities when completely filled, like being able to throw ornate furniture at your enemies, or even just summon one of her daughters to fight alongside you. The thrill gauge will slowly deplete if you go too long without damaging enemies though, so Lady D is a hard snowball character who's at her best when you just never let up on her unrelenting offense. You can also hold her left claw attack to perform a charging ground slam move that feels amazing, and also hold her right claw attack to perform a charging slash, with both of these being great options for opening up fights or damaging multiple enemies at once. And since they can both hit multiple enemies at a time, they of course fill up the thrill gauge incredibly quickly when used properly. And for those few times that you might somehow need even more damage with her, you can also send flesh-eating flies towards enemies, which is really good once you get a feel for sending flies at one enemy and then quickly attacking another to chain kills together even quicker and really max out that thrill gauge. So like I said, she is an incredibly fun boss character just like Heisenberg, but also like Heisenberg, she definitely lacks the sort of depth and replayability that Ethan and Chris have, existing more as a novelty character than anything. On top of the characters, Additional Orders also added 2 new maps, complete with their own hard mode variants. These 2 maps easily have the largest number of enemies in them, as well as some of the trickiest enemy combinations that you'll see in the Mercenaries mode here. But even then, they still don't feel balanced for characters like Heisenberg or Lady D, even in their hard mode variations. Chris and Ethan will definitely be appropriately challenged in these maps on hard mode, and I'm assuming that these maps were largely balanced with Ethan in mind, since he would just feel too weak by comparison if that weren't the case. But when you're able to whip around pieces of metal or just throw giant chairs at everything, even the hardest enemy combinations will struggle to slow you down even a bit. It's worth noting though that these 2 DLC stages were definitely my favorites out of the entire mode, so that at least has to count for something. Overall, the Mercenaries Additional Orders may not seem like much of an expansion on the surface, but it really does flesh out the Mercenaries mode of Village quite a bit and effectively quadruple the amount of content within it. Between the new maps that add even more challenging content, the new characters that all play entirely different from one another, and all the new challenges that you have in the completion list, it adds a pretty insane amount of things to do for fans of Village's take on the Mercenaries. I still don't think that Village has a Mercenaries mode that's as strong as prior Resident Evil entries, but this expansion alone really led to me having a lot more fun with it, and generally having a more positive opinion on it. So while I didn't personally find the third-person perspective to be much of an addition for me, I would say that the Mercenaries Additional Orders is a solid offering. And finally, we've arrived at the most exciting part of the Winters expansion, the full story expansion, Shadows of Rose. Shadows of Rose sees us playing as Rosemary Winters 16 years after the events of Resident Evil Village. We learn that she's kept in close contact with Chris Redfield and his Hound Wolf Squad over the years, and one day, she meets up with one of their members in a park near where she's currently living. They talk a bit about how Rose has always had to live feeling like a freak due to her connection to the mold and the powers that she gained from it, and this squad member mentions that he may know of a way that she could purge herself of said mold and live like a normal person for the rest of her life. Rose, of course, wants to know more, so he takes her back to a local lab of theirs, where they've saved a small sample of the Mega Mice seat from the end of RE Village's main story. He explains to her that the Megamycete saves the memories of everyone who's directly connected to it when they die, something that was already hinted at during the events of Village's main story. And because of this, Mother Miranda's memories have been saved, and she had apparently found a way to safely purge the mold from a person's body during her research. So he proposes that since she's already connected to it, she could try to dive into the Megamycete's memories in an attempt to find out exactly how to do that for herself. And Rose naturally just goes right for it, merging her consciousness with the sample and diving into the memories stored in it. But of course, once she's actually gone in, she finds that she's trapped in a sort of nightmare hellscape, and what little consciousness is left in the Megamycete has no interest in letting her leave, turning this simple quest for information into a desperate fight for survival as Rose tries to find a way to escape. This is certainly a bit of a weird premise compared to the rest of the Resident Evil franchise, but weirdly, I think it works pretty well. Seeing Rose all grown up and hearing how much she's suffered as a result of essentially being a bioweapon herself her whole life weirdly hits home and makes you feel for her after going through so much to protect her and allow her to have a life in the first place in the main game. As much as diving through memories of the dead and essentially moving through a hellish dreamscape as a result of that feels out of place with the rest of the series, I found myself caring a good bit about Rose finding a way to cure herself, and just not really caring about the story admittedly jumping the shark here. And without spoiling too much of what happens later on in Shadows of Rose, I will say that this DLC easily has the most emotional moments in the entire franchise. And after finally sitting down and playing this one for myself, I would absolutely love to see Rose come back as a Resident Evil protagonist in the future, as the growth that she goes through during this DLC has not only made her one of the most relatable characters in the franchise, but has also earned her a solid spot among my other favorites in the series like Leon and Chris. But as many regular viewers of the channel will already know, I care way more about the gameplay than I do about the story. So, how does Shadows of Rose actually play? Well, thankfully, it plays really well. The DLC is played in the third-person perspective that we talked about earlier, which was likely only introduced to the main story in the first place since they had already made it work within Village for the sake of this DLC. Now, that does mean that a lot of the issues we talked about earlier are still present in Shadows of Rose. But I will say that Rose herself is definitely animated a lot better in third person than Ethan is, and they primarily made use of more open areas that play better in the third person perspective for this DLC. So the same third person issues are present, and it definitely still feels like a noticeable step down from the RE2 and 3 remakes in that regard, but they thankfully have less of a negative impact on the overall experience here in Shadows of Rose. And where Village itself feels like an action horror Resident Evil that plays with the pace of a survival horror game, Shadows of Rose also just goes all in on the survival horror. All of those action horror elements like melee attacks, guarding, currency and items dropping from your enemies, and an addictive progression system in the form of weapon upgrades have all been removed. Now, you just find a pistol near the beginning of the DLC, occasionally find some very limited bits of ammo for it, and feel incentivized to actually avoid enemies rather than fight them, as the DLC actually doesn't give you enough ammo throughout it to be able to kill every single enemy that you come across, so you're gonna have to pick and choose a bit. Hell, the in-game tips even encourage you to run away from enemies rather than fight them. So where RE Village felt like a mix of RE7 and RE4, Shadows of Rose actually feels more like the RE2 remake than anything else in terms of pacing and the amount of resources available to you. Which, for someone like me who prefers that slower, more methodical gameplay, was a very pleasant surprise. And speaking of pleasant surprises, Rose has some powers that she can use here thanks to her connection with the mold. Which makes sense because, as I said just a couple minutes ago, Rose is essentially a bioweapon herself. These are slowly unlocked as you progress through the story by finding these samples from Miranda's research. And let me tell you, finding one of these is always incredibly exciting. At the start of the DLC, she won't be able to use her powers at all, but as you find these items, her abilities are progressively boosted, which allow her to find new ways to use her powers in her fight for survival. Finding the first one allows Rose to start breaking down bits of mold in the environment, which allows her to either access new areas or acquire upgrades that weren't available before. Then, after you find another, she learns that she can focus her powers towards enemies to essentially freeze them in place temporarily, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is a very helpful ability to have when you're trying to carefully conserve what little ammo you have. And my personal favorite ability that she has is that when she's grabbed by an enemy, she can actually use her powers to blast them off of her, effectively acting like a defense item from the RE1 or 2 remakes. These are some pretty tame abilities, all things considered, but that's definitely intentional on the developer's part, as you can tell that they wanted to give her something that fits her origins and makes her feel unique as a character, but without undermining the survival horror design. And I think they did a great job at that. These abilities also require you to burn one of a limited number of charges in order to use them, with these charges only being restored by consuming one of the new white herbs that can be found throughout the DLC. So even these abilities themselves are a limited resource that you'll have to be mindful about using. So the core gameplay in this DLC is actually really good, but if I had to bring up one issue, it's that none of these areas that you play through are actually original. From start to finish, you'll go back through a nightmare version of Castle Dimitrescu, a nightmare version of the dollhouse, and a nightmare version of the village itself. These areas do have totally new progression thanks to the stronger emphasis on survival horror design, and you do of course have new items, new enemies, and new boss fights throughout them. But you never visit any locations that feel actually new, almost making Shadows of Rose feel like a glorified asset flip. On top of that, the dollhouse in this DLC is significantly longer than the one in the base game, and even more gimmicky with things like Weeping Angel type enemies and a full-blown stealth section, which really feels like it will hurt the replayability of this DLC. Overall, I think the DLC of Resident Evil Village was very solid, and I'm glad that I finally got around to playing it. But I have to admit that it feels a bit underwhelming when compared to the insane lineup of Resident Evil 7. The Mercenaries mode was a solid addition to the game, and the extra characters and maps included with the expansion add a lot of extra content that won't exactly change your mind if you don't already enjoy the mode, but will give you way more fun within it if you do. The third-person mode for the main story may not have been my thing, but like I mentioned before, I've heard from a ton of fans even before releasing this video who were able to enjoy the game more than before, or even just for the first time because of it. Shadows of Rose is absolutely the star of the show here, giving us a whole 3 to 4 hour story expansion that brings some closure to the events of the main game and introduces us to a new protagonist who could have a ton of potential in the series going forward. If you ask me, I would say that for a full price of $20, it does feel a bit on the expensive side. But of course, there are always bundles and sales that go on all the time and allow you to pick it all up for significantly cheaper if that interests you. It didn't blow me away quite like RE7's DLC lineup did, but it was really enjoyable going through all the content for this video, and if any of it seemed like your thing, then I would definitely recommend you check it out sometime. So consider my official rating for Resident Evil Village's The Winters expansion a solid, worth checking out, but wait for a sale. That's going to wrap up this video, but do be sure to check out my other Resident Evil videos if you haven't already. Or, if you're looking to branch out a bit, maybe check out the series we did a while back where I played every Armored Core game for the first time. Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to our channel members and patrons who make series like this one possible. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, and especially leave a comment to help me out with the algorithm. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one, and I'll hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.